Start now. There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel event, Gender Equality in the Intersectional Climate Justice. My name is Alicia Dyke. I'm an alumna of UFE's Global Development Studies program and a gender equality research and community engagement specialist. We are hosting this event to celebrate International Women's Day 2022. This year's theme is Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. We acknowledge that women and girls worldwide are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change and also often face the burden of being on the front lines of the climate crisis as managers of resources, advocates of sustainable lifestyle, and as staunch human rights defenders of land, water, nature, and communities. Despite this burden, many women and girls have risen to the challenge and have been leaders for climate justice. Even still, their contributions are often ignored and overlooked. Through this panel, we hope to honor women and girls around the globe by identifying the issues that women and girls face in the sector of climate justice, as well as the solutions.
Hi everyone, my name is Zane Sadie. I'm a fourth-year student in the Global Development Studies program at UFE and a refugee research and community engagement specialist. I would like to welcome our panelists and the audience to our event. Alicia and I are moderating this event today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Stalo people in Abbotsford, British Columbia. I would also like to acknowledge and express gratitude for working and learning on traditional Stalo territories at the University of the Fraser Valley. For those of you joining us from other regions, please take a moment to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral lands upon which you live and work. As we commence today's panel event, I would like for us to take a moment of silence for all victims and survivors of violence, including those fleeing the war in Ukraine. Thank you. Please join us in welcoming our panelists. Margaret Timwire is the Executive Director of Environmental Women in Action for Development, a national NGO. Margaret has a leading position in organizational development, and she's passionate about programs and projects leading to greater community development and transformation, driven by interest and professionalism.
Mueni Mutinda is a public policy advisor in climate change at Canadian Foodgrains Bank. Mueni successfully led 2 side events at COP26, and her passion is for people, social justice, and the collective cultivation and nurturing of authentic and inclusive dialogue and strategic partnerships for enhanced cooperation.
Jennifer Hong is a recent graduate from the University of British Columbia with a BSc Honors in Forest Sciences, specializing in forest ecosystem services. Currently, Jennifer is focused on developing Canada's forest bioeconomy as a policy analyst for the Canadian Forest Service. She also engages globally by working for Singapore's National Parks Board. Jen also attended COP26 in November.
As for the structure of this event, each panelist will have 15 minutes to speak in response to a prompt that we will give them to answer from their own perspective and experiences. After each panelist has spoken, we will also have a Q&A session. So we encourage you to type questions that you may have for any panelist or in general in the Q&A box below. If you have a specific question, feel free to direct it towards one panelist. We will also be providing you with contact details for the panelists or for their organization at the end, so you can reach out to them or get some more information. The recording of this event will also be available via video on the UFB College of Arts website following the event. Let's get started.
All right. Our first panelist, Margaret Timwire, is Executive Director of the Environmental Women in Action for Development, a nonprofit organization based in Uganda. Margaret, through your experiences, how have you seen gender interact with climate change? And after identifying these challenges, what do you see as being key in the solution? Margaret, are you there?
Yes, I had not unmuted, I'm sorry. Greetings to you all, and thank you for having me. I want to be sure that you can hear me. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Allow me to first extend my very sincere gratitude to my friends at IDEA for introducing me to your esteemed University of the Fraser Valley and its partners for according me this opportunity to speak to you. I thank you very much indeed. As we are aware, the climate change is now a globally known challenge and a threat to mankind. The damaging effects of climate change can be felt in the short term through natural hazards such as landslides, floods, and hurricanes, and many other catastrophes. And these effects have already been experienced in various countries, including my country, Uganda, and it has affected the biodiversity and ecosystems and water sources. And gender inequality and the climate crisis are two of the world's major challenges today. It is therefore very important for us as human beings to better recognize this trend of events and make a critical connection between gender, social equality, and climate change. It is time to critically consider actions that will lead towards solutions. In Uganda, most women, they are engaged in subsistence farming and raising small livestock for home consumption. They often have limited access to environmental goods and services, and they have limited participation in decision making. And traditionally, they don't have much access to land. In Uganda, land always belonged to the male folk. Of course, there are new policies that are being made and have been made whereby women are able to access land. But even land and inheritance from a family, it is still difficult. Some of the families, some of the regions of the country, they still may not consider a woman for inheritance after his parents have passed on, and they may consider only boys. So those cultural restrictions on gender, for example, women have limited opportunities to making the farm decisions. And this affects the involvement in making decisions for climate smart agricultural practices. Like when I was growing up, I come from the bottom of Uganda, which is called Kigezi. And Kigezi, the biggest part of Kigezi is mountainous, and they use terraces. There was a lot of good practices before, at least for me, when I was growing up. There were still some few good practices. For example, leaving the top of the hill for grazing and for growing trees. But now you don't find that. Even up to the top of the hill, they have already planted crops. And the terraces have been destroyed. The terraces which were being supervised by local leaders, these days it's not being practiced, and that affects a lot on climate change, and then losing the fertility of the soils and less harvesting. So it affects the food security, and this is a very dangerous trend. So we have expertise in making policies, but implementation is limited. And this has led to some catastrophes. Like we have had floods in some parts of the country, like in the eastern part of the country, there is a district called Bududa. We have had floods in Bududa, and then we have droughts in Karamoja, a lot of droughts. And when it comes to disproportionately affecting women, in many of these situations, women are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than men, mostly as they constitute the majority of the world's poor. And the poor are dependent on the natural resources through agriculture. But women also face socioeconomic and political barriers, and this limits their coping capacity to climate change. For example, the women and men in the rural areas of Uganda, they are particularly vulnerable because they're extremely dependent on the local natural resources for their livelihoods. But still, women who live in rural communities are the ones mostly in charge of making sure that there is water, there is food, and there's firewood for cooking and for heating. And they face many challenges when the weather patterns change abruptly. And when women face the problems of unequal access to resources and to decision-making processes, both in leadership and at family level, we are still in a patriarchal kind of society, and also some existing cultural barriers and stereotypes, whereby they say, oh, the woman can't do this and the woman can't do the other. And then there's destruction of natural resources due to climate change, which pose greater impact on women, since the women have to walk long distances to look for food. They have to walk long distances looking for firewood and also land for farming. Because sometimes they don't own the land, they have to walk looking for where they can rent land or grow crops on somebody's land, and then they share what they produce. So there's a lot of limitation. Women are limited, and Uganda is not exceptional. They are limited. And women, they form the highest labor force in agriculture. In fact, these days, you'll find in some areas, women are the ones cultivating all the food that is being brought to the table to some families. Yes, there are a number of men who are helping, but some of the men are not helping at all. And they are mainly responsible for the more time-consuming and labor-intensive manual tasks, which they use very simple tools and limited access to good technology and due to lack of training. So Uganda has mostly tropical climate characterized by stable rainfall patterns. However, the effects of climate change have turned the seasons around, with the country experiencing shorter and longer rains and harsher droughts, especially in the eastern and northern part of the country. And over the past years, Uganda has experienced frequent hazards and disasters, such as floods, landslides, droughts, and armed conflict, among others, that have resulted in deaths, damage to property, and loss of livelihoods. The impact of disasters it usually has on humans is on the economy, especially agricultural infrastructure, and the ecosystems, varying from the geographical region to the next one. So the example we have is one of Bududa in eastern Uganda. And in Bududa, even as the second time of the flooding was in 2019. And in 2019, we had loss of lives, and we had big landslides that hit a number of sub-counties in the Bududa district of Uganda. And this came from the consequence of abrupt rains because of the weather patterns changing. And this caused a lot of suffering for especially the women moving from one place to another. That's why I have some pictures, but I will ask Alicia to show how this impacted on the women folk. You'll see a picture of a woman carrying a mattress, and some women carrying probably their food in the gunny bags, trying to move to another area. And then when they migrate to another area, you see them beginning to plant food afresh, which is also very difficult. So I think how greater gender equality on that topic, I'll talk about the role of women in addressing the impact of climate change. So despite the adverse impact of climate change and the vulnerability of women in communities with less gender equality and less participation in leaderships, it's very important to create a conducive environment to change this trend and train women to impart leadership skills, which will enable them to compete for governance of their communities. It should be noted that under the right conditions, women are greater promoters and agents to change and adaptation to the impact of climate change. Women have always participated and attained a great experience in effective utilization of the limited resources that are available and accessing, including the good knowledge on water harvesting and storage. And then food preservation, locally, like in our communities, they used to have storage, which is locally made, where they would store food that could even stay, like millet and sorghum, which could stay for a long time, except that they're not, these days, it's not many people practicing those good practices. And women in homes are seen as pillars of the families, And this fact is critical in enhancing adaptation to climate change. And since there are no limitations for women to ensure adaptation or implementing measures to reduce climate change, empowering women with literacy, knowledge, and skills would immeasurably improve the welfare of the families and a country at a country level and even global level. If women are empowered, it may include, but not limited to, access to resources to be more productive in decision-making, education, and attitude change from traditional norms. Climate change, adaptive interventions on agriculture, energy, water sector, they need to be addressed to be gender-specific, to have gender-specific impacts of climate change to ensure that there's access to water, there's access to food security, agriculture, energy, health, and disaster management. For example, during the floods and droughts, the women can be equipped with knowledge and skills to be able to be adaptive. There is also need for the roles and responsibilities of women to be captured in the country activity development plans in these countries. If countries could include the engaging women to participate in planning for matters that concern them, making decisions at all planning and developmental stage, especially relating to knowledge, empowerment, technology, and other interventions aimed at addressing the impacts of climate change, it would be very helpful. Because the role of women in addressing climate change can be ensured at the donor level, funding agencies and donors, if they could always allocate a specific budget and activity line for the critical issues of gender inequalities, that would also be good for adaptation for climate change. And they need also for increasing the women's representation in leadership and decision-making, to redistributing the care work and productive resources, progress towards a gender equal and sustainable future. It starts with taking action today. We all need to join hands and take action today and not tomorrow. A few recommendations. It is very important to support the initiatives of women in agriculture and other productive initiatives for empowerment of human capital. There is boundless need to support women to climb ladders of leadership at all levels, as women's representation and leadership appears to drive better environmental outcomes. Our governments, is recommended also the governments and private sector and civil society ought to fund and support women's organizations, which bring the voices of those who that they best represent and understand from their own experiences, and they will help to keep the governments accountable to the people they are meant to serve, which include issues that are key to climate action and that prioritize the well-being of people and the planet. It's desirable for the governments to invest in protecting women's health, and most of the time they are more at risk of sickness and death from disasters and other diseases much more than males. And these also include like maternal and child health. We need maternal and child health interventions. Thank you very much. I'll stop there. I hope I didn't go beyond my time.
No, that was great. Margaret, would you like me to share your photos now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I have them on a Word document from Hillary. Is everybody able to see the pictures? Okay, great. So if you want, Margaret, you can comment on the significance of these photos as I show them and tell me when to scroll down.
Yes, these are photos I did not take myself, but these are from the government report when there were floods in the districts that I mentioned in Bududa. And this is one of the women is trying to get away from the flooded area and to move to a safer place. And the only belonging I think she felt important was the mattress that she's carrying on her head. Much as it is old, it shows you the status of poverty of the women in some of our countries.
Here's another. If you would like to comment on this one.
Yes, this one you can see the women, a woman, and one is like a girl. They're also trying to run away from Bududa, from the flooded area, from the landslides, and they're trying to carry away mostly their belongings in Ghana bags. There is a man in front, but the two behind are a woman and a girl.
And this is the last one here.
Yeah.
Would you like to comment on that one?
Yes, this one shows after the disaster, when the district was having that catastrophe of flooding and landslides. These are people who were taken to a safer place and have been allocated some piece of land. So they are now tilling the new piece of land, which means they have no food to start with. It must be a difficult time, and they are trying to plant the new crops for their food.
Great, thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank you.
Photos. Okay, now we're going to move on to Mueni to speak. So Mueni, not only are you a public policy advisor for climate change at the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, but you also led 2 side events at COP26. Given your expertise, what do you have to say about the intersections between gender equality and climate change, and how it affects women all over the world and even here in Canada?
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you, Margaret, for starting this really exciting conversation. Yes, my name is Mueni Mutinda. I work for Canadian Foodgrains Bank as a public policy advisor on climate change. I'm glad to be here, and I will actually speak today in my own capacity as a development professional. I will share my experience and learning relative to gender differentiated impacts of climate change in the Global South, specifically in East Africa, where I recently spent nearly 6 years. And I'll do that through intersectional lens. Thanks, Alicia, for the question. Yeah, and then I'm looking forward to the conversation after with the rest of my co-panelists. So I'm happy to join this conversation from the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, who are the first peoples of Prince Edward Island and have called this beautiful island home for over 12,000 years. Epiquet is the traditional name, Mi'kmaq name given to the island, meaning something lying on the water. I want to begin by recognizing and celebrating the work, love, resilience, joy, passion, power, and contributions of women the world over, because frankly, none of us would be here without them. I stand on shoulders of giants, my grandmothers and the mothers, aunties, and sisters I've been fortunate to have in my life, attending to me, guiding me, disciplining me, and loving me. We recognize and acknowledge here and now on this International Women's Day, the strength, resolve, and commitment of women who have gone before, the Wangari Maathais of the world, who through movements like the Green Belt movement have mobilized and changed history for women. The women alive today who are navigating life and all its complexities the best ways they can, those in our lives, communities, and countries, and those to come. Their vision for a better life now for themselves and their children, their joy and resilience are what we all stand on today. And these characteristics both challenge and compel all of us to not only stand in recognition of the achievements through these dialogues, but to take up our responsibilities where we are and move the needle toward equity and justice for all. I think it's important to launch from the foundation that the agency and self-empowerment of particularly small-scale farmers in the Global South, and my experience again is specifically in East and West Africa, where I have seen women doing incredible and innovative things despite the restrictions they face within the sociocultural, political, economic, environmental arenas. The agency is already there. So when we talk about enhancing gender equality. To me, this is an invitation into a conversation to first understand what inequalities form the realities of women and men in particular contexts, how these rob all of society now of innovative and transformational solutions, and what we're going to do about it. In fact, women in the rural and urban settings are already occupying leadership roles, doing what needs to be done to feed their families, diversify food sources, work within social groups to generate access to capital, resolve land degradation issues, support each other to find solutions to negative climate impacts, and manage their resources and assets sustainably. Women are already building social capital and networking across institutions, schools and churches are primary, and other sectors. They are already innovating and improving upon solutions to the climate crisis. And this is where strategic partnerships that are radically inclusive and centered on communities experiencing these come in. Because we know there are gender differentiated impacts of climate change. And I think Margaret did an excellent job of highlighting that. And this is related to lack of access, exclusion, lack of representation, and active and inclusive participation on all the areas across society that we've talked about. So the questions then become, what does it mean when you do not own land and there's a crisis with your ability to feed your family? What options do you have? This is the reality for a lot of women small-scale farmers. What does it mean when you are not at decision-making tables to bring forward your challenges and actively participate in finding solutions that work for you too? And what does it mean when disasters happen, slow onset and immediate, such as drought, floods, famine, erosion, violence, sickness, and so much more, and you lose assets like your home, your ability to provide for your family, your ability to work? These are some of the barriers. These are some of the ways women small-scale farm producers and other socially marginalized groups are impacted and have been for decades now by the climate injustice. And yet, as they engage in subsistence farming, they're active participants across the agricultural value chain as buyers and sellers. If you've been to any market anywhere in the global south, you know and have seen that it's mostly women, young mothers, middle-aged elderly women buying and selling produce. They perform their productive and reproductive roles simultaneously, even as their participation and work is most often not seen, not acknowledged, not celebrated. This conversation, therefore, is about justice and putting in place policies and processes that include the rightful contributions of women as active members of all of society, as human beings with rights and responsibilities. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, put out their 2021 report, which discusses the physical science basis of climate change. Building on previous reports, it lays out the current state of the climate, including how it is changing and the role of human influence, the state of knowledge about possible climate futures, climate information relevant to regions and sectors, and limiting human-induced climate change. In a nutshell, because it's highly technical, but also engaging, and I had to read it as part of my work, but I actually found it quite informative. So in a nutshell, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. And over time, this is getting worse. Observed increases in well-mixed greenhouse gas concentrations since around 1750 are unequivocally caused by human activities. So that's where we start. We created the problem, so now we need to figure out how to solve the problem, what situations and systems we need to change, include everyone so that we can address the global problems that we currently face. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, has been discussing climate change for the last 30 years, during which time women, small-scale farmers, and other socially marginalized groups at the front lines of climate change have been adapting and doing their best to mitigate climate-induced calamities and losses not of their own making. They live in fear and are pushed to deploy coping strategies to address the challenges they face. For example, many moved in with relatives. We saw this large movements of people during the pandemic from cities to rural areas. I think here in Canada too, where we have seen intergenerational living, and it has co-benefits as well. Just to plug in there, that this has been actually happening in the global South, but in the West, it's like it took the pandemic for us to get there. That happened, that movement, migration from cities to urban areas happened in cities like Nairobi, where I was living at the time, which suddenly became a luxury to live in. Many people sell off assets. They sell labor of themselves and others in their family, like children. They eat last or not at all. And we know this to be a fact for women and girls. They beg, they steal. There are other awful, awful coping mechanisms that women are forced to utilize. And my question at this point is, what does this do to human dignity? International processes such as the annual UNFCCC Conference of Parties, I was fortunate to attend COP26 last year in Glasgow, Scotland, and other international political moments and spaces are and can be for us in the global north, where we intentionally join our voices with the South in calling for action beyond rhetoric. There's no more time for rhetoric. The North and South divide is based on distrust, frustration, inequality, empty promises, double standards, and that has to change. The only way that can change is if we actually begin to move in action beyond words. So with this conversation being so complex, the questions I want to leave you with are, how do we work? How do we show up with integrity and courage? So from my own lived experience as a woman who is Black, educated, bicultural, without a vehicle, for example, when I was living in Kenya, I chose not to have a vehicle because I lived in the city, which, as it turned out, is not a normal move for a working, successful urban woman. And I don't have children, so I was just crossing all the T's and the wrong T's in that context. I want to challenge us to see the rich and diverse milieu of our own socially constructed identities, find our true selves, and embrace all of who we are. And we are much more than these constructions of identities, because when we do that, we'll have the courage to recognize that in each other, we will have the courage to recognize that the truth of people, women in each other, that they're not just women, that they are much more than mothers and sisters and the productive assets, the reproductive assets in our communities and homes. My experience living and working with the UN, CFGB, and others in East Africa between 2015 to 2021, and I must say, I was born in East Africa. I was born in Kenya, but I've grown up in Kenya. That, you know, what my experience being back there as an adult was not what I would call a fun and welcome experience, given all the intersections I've just mentioned. I was often caught by surprise, interpreting culture, experience, societal and cultural perceptions and expectations of who I was in that context. This experience brought out biases and blind spots within myself that were painful to face, but that I needed to face. So to me, until we understand who we are, how our experiences and context and education have shaped who we are today and how we see the world, our cross-cultural competence and our seeing of people across all their intersections will remain wanting. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Mueni. That was great. Now let's move on to Jen Hong. Now, Jen, as a delegate to COP26, how did you see issues of gender equality and climate justice discussed at this level? And what steps do you believe are necessary to take to resolve them?
Thanks so much, Zane. And thank you so much for having me and providing me with this platform here today. I am a big proponent and very passionate about youth getting engaged in these types of conversations and being in these spaces. So I definitely think this is a great way to start that and explore those conversations. And also thank you so much to my fellow panelists. Today, to answer your question, I will be definitely taking a look at this through the lens of forestry, which is my background. I have a background in forest science, and intersectionality as well. So, similar to what my fellow panelists have mentioned, if we look at this through the lens of forestry, climate change disproportionately affects women and girls as they do take on these traditional gender roles, and they take on major responsibilities within their communities that are dependent on these resources, so threatened forests, for example. And then their ability to make decisions related to forest land management and their overall access, control, and distribution to these lands and their ecosystem services is then limited compared to individuals who identify as men or other different social groups. So we see that there's also a lot of different perceptions associated with the use of forest. For example, women spend as much, if not more time in the forest as men, but a lot of times that their activities are not as highly valued. And then they're not as aware of the different forest related programs or beneficial opportunities to them. And there's also different cultural perceptions and stereotypes that are related to the use of forest as well. So because of this, there's the systematic devaluation of women's work and their knowledge about the forest, and it legitimizes this men's dominance in forest governance instead. If we look through in terms of scarcity in resources, it can then lead to a vicious cycle in a lot of others. So there's increased deforestation that's caused by a lack of other reliable energy sources or food sources that could then lead to decreased biodiversity that contributes to climate change, and then increased health risks as well. Looking at disease outbreaks or disease carrying risks, then this negatively will affect already vulnerable and susceptible groups of individuals such as women and children. We had mentioned drought in this panel today. When we look at forest fires, it's very similar. We're not only now affecting the local forests, which are an important resource, but then this can lead to women working even harder to secure household livelihoods. And for example, walking further distances to get firewood, which we had just discussed as well. And depending on how forest dependent women are, it can also lead to disproportionate consequences of climate related displacement. And in terms of looking at access to training and education, because these women are focused on their livelihoods and sustaining them, they don't have access to all these other things. And that again reduces their capacity to make decisions and impact decisions at a higher level. So in terms of how we can address this, so there's a lot of clear research that shows as well that the least gender equal societies are also the ones that are the most vulnerable to climate change. And we want to look and see how we can address these in a systematic way. And a lot of times, we need to empower women, right, as leaders. Again, this shows a representation, and it can definitely inspire other women to be leaders themselves. Given their extensive lived experiences and interactions with natural resources and local forests, there's a lot of traditional knowledge there that must be acknowledged, valued, and leveraged, and centered as well in our policies and our practices in order to make change. We must be cognizant of actively making this space for them at the table, and then making this the norm and the standard, providing a meaningful opportunity to engage in these spaces. So when we're looking at forests and climates in particular, gender responsive activities should promote gender equality, women's empowerment, and this inclusion so that women and children are able to benefit from their local forests. And there's lots of opportunities then for women to lead the way, for example, what we call non-timber forest products, so other things that are associated with the forest. And this involves changing these power relationships, and participation shouldn't only be considered when we're looking at just the opportunities, but also looking at assets as well. So give these women and underrepresented groups, control over their local forests, as assets to improving livelihoods and their well-being, safeguard their rights, and that will help to bolster against climate change related events and their consequences. And the other thing that we discuss as well is focusing on local communities and local adaptive capacity building. I think sometimes when we consider what actions we can take, we think on a very large scale, but trying to really place ourselves in one local community to focus on creating change and building local adaptive capacity is really important. An example in Canada that I can share a little bit more about too was that in terms of wildfire responses, they worked with Indigenous communities to manage the emergency management system in those communities. So that would help to respond to wildfire. We also see that there's also a lot of sustainable opportunities within entrepreneurial style type of programs, which could also help to build capacity and train new women leaders to manage natural resources and take climate action. And when we look at intersectionality, when we're working at the lowest common intersection and address the barriers that women specifically face. So for example, childcare is something that we see in North America as a barrier for women to access other opportunities, such as higher education. So finding a way to address this barrier will then hopefully help them gain a chance to access these opportunities. When we're considering moving forward to address climate change, we also see that there's a large climate finance commitment component to this, as we saw in the last COP. So these will need to be carefully considered to continue supporting women and girls from the global south in addressing these barriers. And we're trying to avoid exacerbating any of these intersectional inequalities. So using that lens to really address those issues and not exacerbating any other effects there. And I think the other important thing, so again, I'm focusing a lot on speaking to the forestry component, but we had spoken about agriculture as well in this panel. And I would say that, working together across sectors will be really important as well, and across different types of stakeholders. So bringing these women again into the fold, into these conversations, and having knowledge from these sectors and discussing together and having a forum for that, creating those linkages will be key to strengthening the knowledge that we all hold and amplifying resilience in their livelihoods. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Jen, and all of our panelists. Now we'd like to move on to the Q&A portion of our panel. If you still have a question that you'd like to ask one of our panelists, feel free to type it into the chat. But I saw one specifically for Margaret. So from Brianna, she was hoping, Margaret, if you could talk more about traditional practices in Uganda that have worked in the past to make a sustainable development. So are there any traditional practices that have helped kind of alleviate climate change or things that have really helped the environment?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mentioned the practice of use of terraces. Terraces have been used for quite a long time. Well, ever since I grew up, I found terraces being used for controlling the soils from landslides and from the rains running down the soils. So, and the tradition was you have your piece of land and contour, and maybe on top there is another person whose land is his, or another person below you, and they worked very well together. And that was a good tradition. And sometimes they would work together not to miss out on the season, on the time before the rains go away, before the rains are completed. Then the people are able to work together. You work in my piece of land, and then we move and work on your piece of land, and then we plant. And when we are weeding, we weed in my piece of land, and after that, we weed in another person's piece of land to make we keep within the weather patterns without missing them, and be able to have a good harvest. So that was one of the, and being able to control. I don't know if I've answered your question, but if you, I can explain more.
Okay, looks like Margaret had some technical difficulties. Hopefully we can.
Sorry, my internet was off, was on and off.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure how it was for, but I'm not sure if we were able to hear the last part of what you said. Margaret, would you maybe just sum up what you said in a sentence or two?
Okay, what I was summarizing is that traditionally, even without people being educated, they had their own methods of controlling soil erosion and working together. Even some pests, they could control pests by mixing the ash in water and adding chili paper, and they spray some of their crops with that. Then they had also a way of sending away the pests and also the encroachment of birds on the, for example, the sorghum when it is growing and the millet. But one of the methods was to take the children there to keep the birds away, which was not good because we want the children in school now. But when children were not going to school, then they would keep away the birds from the crops. And then they know the plants that the bees can have to make the honey. So they know which plants to plant near the beehive, and many other methods of controlling like pests from the banana plantations, being able to cut off some of the stems and so on. So they had their own traditional methods, but now we have new methods of agriculture which people have tried to follow, but not even successfully because of lack of extension workers.
Very interesting. So Jen and Mueni, do you have any also insight to add to that question either? Also, I mean, no? Okay, maybe we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so maybe more from Mueni and Jen. So for you two that attended COP26, did you see evidence of actual solutions to the problems you've been describing being put into action? And do you see an end to these problems? Maybe Mueni, you could go first.
Sure, thank you. And I didn't comment on the last point because I think Margaret did a good job of summarizing what's happening in terms of that Indigenous knowledge already driving innovations and solutions. Yeah, so COP26, I mean, it's a key political moment, and I think that it's important, especially for us, civil society actors, international development workers in the global north, to be aware and to be present at these key international moments as observers, but also to be informed on what the barriers are. So some of the things that I saw were that there is a divide. It's palpable. And you know, when I joined the organization in this role, I was with the organization in a different role in East Africa, but in the public policy space, listening to the intersessions that happen before you get to COPs, you know, and those are usually in the spring. Even then, the conversations last year, because of the pandemic, they were online, and even then, you could really see Global South country parties calling to account and really going back to what about the delivery of that 100 billion USD per year that wealthy nations promised back in the day that they were going to deliver to address climate impacts. That has not been fulfilled. And it goes back to 2009, I believe. So it's been a long time coming, and you can see why the Global South, particularly island developing states, other vulnerable places, parts of the world that further compromise the well-being of populations in those parts of the world. And, you know, we know that the worst affected are usually women. They're usually socially disadvantaged already. So how do we stop that from happening? And at the COP26 process, I think, while this is an important space to be in as an attendee, we did see barring of civil society, active participation, Indigenous populations, youth, the media being restricted to attend, and then favoring the private sector. So, you know, there's different things happening there. And I don't know that at these moments we can actually expect a life-shifting decision or leadership, because that's actually what I'm interested to hear what Jennifer says. But my experience of that was there was no leadership, and the world is looking to these nearly 200 country party leaders to step up, and nobody does. So there's this vacuum, and expectations are high. But the one thing that I saw and participated in was this march in the middle of that 2-week meeting, 100,000 people in Glasgow, Scotland, marching with passion and commitment, and really driving the message that regardless of what the leaders are going to do, whether they're not going to meet their targets and move beyond rhetoric into action, the people will. And I think if we think through history, really change comes from the people. It comes from the heart. It needs to be localized, and it needs to be in our DNA. And so I think that's exciting. The other thing that Jennifer mentioned in her last comments were about a whole of government, whole of country, like everybody needs to be at the table. The sectors, the private sector, academic institutions, NGOs, Indigenous organizations, everybody needs to be at the table, and that's the only way we're going to get to solutions. And I think that's important if we really want solutions to the challenges that we face.
Thank you so much for that, Mueni. Now I see another question here.
Sorry, Zane, can Jen also answer that question? It was also sorry.
Oh, good. Thanks so much, Mueni. I definitely echo everything that you're saying. And you know, this was my first time at COP, and being there firsthand was definitely very, very frustrating, because there were a lot of moments where I wasn't able to access spaces that normally we would have been able to access. So it was quite frustrating. But again, like, you know, we make do. I was still able to access like the different side events, and also go to that march as well. And I think that was really where I felt so much power in terms of just being around people who are like-minded and who had very similar interests. And again, it's a very different climate than being around those who are inside COP. You know, there's definitely different stakes there, right? There's political stakes, and you have the bureaucracy and all these different things. So I think for me, in terms of like seeing tangible actions, I would say it's more so with the people. And I think going back to the point about, you know, having everybody around the table, something that really stuck out to me during some discussions I had with those at COP as well, was we were talking about building trust and building relationships, right? Which is the only way that we're able to move this forward and create action. But that takes time, right? That takes time and then you compare it to the discussions at COP and the rhetoric, which is, we need to do this now. There's no time, right? And this is urgent, which is, it's definitely true, but it's really taking a step back too, and considering how do we reconcile those two very different paces, right? And so I think that was the one huge takeaway that I got from COP, was just trying to find ways that we can build trust with people, but doing so at a pace that would make sense with the climate, and just focusing more again on those small interactions that we have that'll hopefully build up to create change as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, so I see a question here asking, how does the white savior complex harm achieving sustainable solutions? Any of the panelists, feel free to answer this question.
I can start, and then maybe others can come in. And I think I closed off my statement with that about checking our own biases and being courageous enough to understand that, wow, I may be going to that community. And in my case, I was born in a particular place, and I felt I was going home, except I had all these other things about my identity that maybe they weren't as obvious here in Canada. And so going there really brought them out, and the way that I work, the way that I speak, the way I see the world was rubbing against what the expectations are for that context. And so how then do we shift our frame of reference? Because our frame of reference is our frame of reference. Mine is not yours, and that's okay. But how do we go from, I see my frame of reference and I'm okay, and I've done the work within mine to be able to see yours without trying to add to it or trying to take away from it or judge it or anything like that. And that's where I was talking about the lens through which we look at people, women, socially marginalized groups. It's not one of, it should not be, it's not helpful for anyone if, my thinking is, oh, I have knowledge that they definitely need, or, I mean, that's actually problematic. That's like, don't even engage, because you haven't done the work to be self-aware enough to see that until you do your own internal, well, what is it that I think that I can offer these people that they're living with passion and love and kindness. And I think that also goes back to the way that I started with celebrating and acknowledging the achievements of women past, present, and future, because they've done a lot. Whether society recognizes it, that's besides the point. We know that, and we've been beneficiaries of that. And that's where we begin, with this sort of acknowledgement that there is something going on that has contributed to us being where we are, and we need to celebrate that.
Thank you, Mueni. Do Jennifer or Margaret, do you have any perspective on that question?
Yes, I can answer something. For me, in my view, there is a lot that we can do, especially in the communities, creating awareness and sensitization. Because for me, coming from the community that I come from, some of them are vulnerable, some of them appreciate to learn more, to get the skills to be able to do better, to practice, for example, the smart agricultural methods. Because right now, for example, the area that I have been in, sensitizing the people about the revival of the terraces that control soil erosion and loss of fertility of the soils, they appreciate the information because they think, they say, we thought we are doing a good thing, we thought we are doing it well, but we appreciate the knowledge, and you find that they are interested in coming for the meetings. If people can come, 100 people come, farmers can come to listen, it means they want to change their way of doing things. And then we talk to them about climate change and social inclusion. And then social inclusion, you do it is in practice. They come to understand that there is no committee that should have 90% or 80% of men. There should be women also on the committee. and to be able to make decisions together, and also the role of women, the role that is played by the women. So in my view, we can actually do a lot by imparting more knowledge and skills to the communities, to look at what is happening today, to look at the weather patterns, to look at the changes that are happening, and to look at the dangers, what will happen to them, sustainability of their soils, sustainability of their agricultural products and food security, and be able to have better yields and good harvests.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Jen, did you have something to say about that, or?
No, I think they both spoke to that question very well. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And we're just gonna quickly close with one last question that we thought was really great from Hillary at Videa. So just maybe a quick sentence or two, do you all have any thoughts on how we can strengthen global solidarity when it comes to the climate crisis? Maybe Jen, you could go first.
Sure, yeah. I'm still trying to think of what I want to say for this one, but I think the things that pop out in my head at first is we see social media being used quite a bit when it comes to connecting people and kind of providing that sense of global solidarity. And I think that's been really, really helpful in propelling and moving the climate crisis, or addressing issues of the climate crisis and raising awareness to those who might not have otherwise seen it. But at the same time, we've seen that it can also create a lot of polarizing effects. So I think, continuing to engage with people in meaningful dialogue that leaves room for them to come to the table with their truths and with their understandings and ways of knowing in the world will be really important to strengthen a global solidarity, and really doing so in a fulsome way, because there's lots of issues when it comes to the climate crisis, right? And there's lots of things that will be local to certain communities and regions, and we need to take those into account rather than kind of blanketing all of the climate issues into one. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Mueni?
Yeah, thanks. And if I can add to that, building solidarity, I think I can refer back to community engagement. I've worked in the past with First Nations communities in Ontario and Eastern Canada several years ago. And one of the things that we learned as part of community engagement that is effective is about being invited in and sitting in, listening, and really then figuring out what are the needs and priorities of the people in those specific contexts that then need to be amplified in some way. So I think that's important, just to support Jennifer's point. And then bringing that to spaces like, the G20 later this year, COP27, we already know that in these spaces, conversations around climate finance delivery and leveraging more funds toward adaptation than mitigation, because that's been the weighting, that it's 60% adaptation, and then it's like, well, how do small local communities actually get access to those funds? So that balance. So there is a role for us to play in helping to amplify the voices of women's rights organizations, community-based organizations in the global south, the countries themselves that need us in the north to speak to our governments. And this is where I think policy and justice come in, because the issue of climate change is a justice issue. It is justice. Thanks.
Thank you. Margaret, do you have a few last words on that? Global solidarity?
I agree with my colleagues. Only to add that with the global solidarity, I would wish the global leaders to work together, make the decisions, make the policies. That sounds to me like a top-down approach, but when it comes to implementation, I would wish them to engage right from the indigenous communities and use a bottom-up approach in implementation to mitigate whichever they have to mitigate and be able to achieve the goal of climate change control.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm going to quickly share with you all some information about panelists and their organizations so you can get in touch and get engaged with them. Hopefully you can all see that. Perfect. So Environmental Women in Action for Development is Margaret's organization where she works. And then Mueni, she has her LinkedIn here, and then Canadian Foodgrains Bank. Then Jen's LinkedIn as well, and then also BCCIC Climate Change Branch, which she attended COP26 with. And then finally, we wanted to also kind of include World University Service of Canada. This is a club at UFE that Zane and I are actually both a part of that focuses on awareness raising, and we bring refugees into Canada to study at UFE. So if you're at UFE, that's a great way to get involved.
All right. Thank you to all of our panelists and participants. Please do look for the recording on the UFE College of Arts YouTube channel. There will also be closed captions available on this video. And thank you, Pauline Canedo, and of course, Gitanjali Gill for your help in organizing this event. And thank you also to the staff at the Research Office, College of Arts, and SoJust for your support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.